and also making sure that they are providing actionable information to participate in conservation. Because oftentimes we leave either underrepresented minorities or lower socioeconomic classes out of the conservation movement. And so it's really important to include them as well, as they can oftentimes be disproportionately affected by climate change or environmental challenges.
So welcome to Shellphone, the podcast that gives the ocean its very own hotline. Join us as we hear from ocean stewards, discover threats to ocean health, and learn ways that we can all answer the ocean's call. This podcast is brought to you in part by the Tampa Bay Estuary Program and Coastal Creative. I'm Harmony Dawson, and joining us this episode is Maria Cartolano. To start us off today, could you give us a brief introduction into who you are and what your role is at the University of Miami?
Sure. So I am a lecturer in the Department of Marine Biology and Ecology at the University of Miami Rosenstiel School of Marine, Atmospheric, and Earth Science.
So in your role as lecturer, first I'd love to ask what some of the classes that you've taught are.
Sure. So in my position as a lecturer, I'm also the track coordinator for our marine mammal science track of the Masters of Professional Science program. So we call that the MPS program. It's a little bit different than a Masters of Science or a PhD in that it's more focused on practical training and networking and getting experience to build up your resume and give you skills to enter the workforce as a marine biologist in various fields, kind of moving a little bit away from traditional research. So because I am the track coordinator for the marine mammal science track, I teach a lot of marine mammal science courses, which is very fun for me. So I teach biology of marine mammals. I teach conservation and management of marine mammals. For undergraduate students, I teach survey of marine mammals, and then I also teach 2 readings courses about the toxicology and physiology of marine mammals. And then I also teach a class called Broadening Participation in Marine Science, where our goal is to plan an outreach event where we get to bring local students from K through 12 schools to our campus.
Awesome. It sounds like those courses maybe incorporate a lot of out of classroom work, like in the field or in a lab. Is that true?
Yeah, most of my students are really interested in getting hands-on experience. And while we don't have a bunch of different types of marine mammals, here in South Florida, we do have a lot of cetacean species and Sirenian species. We have manatees. So the students do get to go out in the field and deal with strandings, rescue, and rehabilitation. They can take courses at marine mammal facilities to get more experience in behavior modification and analysis, as well as veterinary care. So the goal is to get them hands-on experience. I'm also developing a course for next semester with a colleague where we are going to be doing an applied studies class. So we'll be doing mostly lab work related to marine megafauna for undergraduate students. So the goal is to always get students in the field. That was my favorite part as an undergraduate and graduate student, was getting into the field and kind of learning what I liked and what I didn't like in the field.
Okay, that's awesome. In a previous conversation, you said that it was a surprise when you discovered your passion for education. What was that discovery and the process of making the shift in your career towards education like for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've always kind of had an open mind of what I wanted to do, but I knew I really wanted to do research of marine science in general. And so during my PhD, I really fell in love with laboratory work and physiology. And then in my postdoc, I was doing toxicology work, and I really loved it. But I started taking classes about teaching as a postdoc, which isn't always as common. Sometimes as graduate students, we'll get experiences to TA, but you won't get a lot of training in teaching, which ends up being a big part of the career if you stay in academia. So during my postdoc, I realized that I actually was really enjoying teaching. I used to have really terrible fears of public speaking. I talked very quickly. I didn't really like to teach. And then once I kind of got some practice with it and started feeling more comfortable, I realized I really liked it. And so after the postdoc, I had to make the terrible decision of what to do with my life. And it was scary, but I realized I really wanted to move towards education and making education accessible for all different types of people. And so I was applying for a lot of different types of jobs, both in academia and outside of academia. And I ended up teaching high school for a year, which is something that I never thought I would do in my life. And it ended up being like the best thing for me. I really learned how to translate science to a younger age group. I learned how to teach effectively. I learned how to make sure that I'm assessing learning appropriately. And so I was really thankful for that opportunity. And then a position opened up at the University of Miami, which is where I have been for quite a long time, as a lecturer. And a lecturer is a little bit different than maybe a research professor in that you're mostly teaching, and you do get to still dabble in research and outreach and service, but your primary role is teaching. And so it's kind of this perfect fit for me. I get to teach and I get to mentor students, which has been really wonderful.
Awesome. Yeah, I just want to note on the point that you made about public speaking that during my college education, the college that I went to was smaller and also had a lot of focus on like presentations as well as other skills, but it seemed to be more of a focus than at some other colleges, and that really has benefited the students there. I've heard feedback from professors who mentor in like careers for students that that's like a major skill that employers have like noted of them. So it's interesting how different skills come in from experiences that you might not expect them to come from.
Yeah, that's awesome. I remember like always thinking that it was just something I was never good at and never really thought I could get better. And so I hope, students learn that it is something that it's a skill and you have to practice at it, and it does get better, because I for sure never thought I would enjoy standing in front of a classroom every single day, and I really do.
Yeah, and I never thought I would be here interviewing people and speaking about topics like this so often like I do
That's
now.
Awesome.
And then just kind of out of curiosity, what did you imagine yourself doing when you were a kid, and were you always interested in the ocean?
Yeah, I was one of those students one of those kids that grew up on the Florida coastline. I lived in Pensacola for most of my childhood. So I grew up going to the beach, and I always loved it. And I was very lucky in that my parents and my grandparents constantly brought me to aquariums. And I remember always like being most interested in the scientists that were working at these aquariums and facilities. And so it's always been something I wanted to do. And then actually in third grade, my parents moved to Pennsylvania. And so I was away from the ocean. And I just remember like always being the one student in class who wanted to be a marine biologist. I know a lot of people in this field can relate to wanting to do it since they were just a kid. And I think I always saw myself as a field biologist and out on a boat or collecting samples. And then this is another example of where I didn't really think I would end up where I did. But during my PhD and even during my undergraduate, I realized that I liked working in a laboratory much more than I did in the field. And so I really enjoyed pipetting and doing assays and really analyzing samples and looking at the data. So I've always seen myself studying marine biology, but I don't think I ever saw what I would actually have done.
Then, before we dive into talking more about marine science education and your program Waves, I'd love to hear about some of the research projects that you have been involved in. There are a couple different ones, but the first study that caught my attention was focused on the impacts of stress in fish caused by a music festival that was held right on the coast. So can you tell us a little bit about the context of this study and the issue of noise pollution as a whole?
Sure. So this study came about when a local music festival that's quite large and it's globally known. It's usually held in downtown Miami, and it was moved to Virginia Key State Park and Virginia Key in general, which is a fairly green area left in Miami. And it's on an island, and there were a lot of concerns from locals within the community of Key Biscayne and environmentalists on what the impact of this music festival would be on the local environment, as well as there's a University of Miami experimental hatchery across the street from our Rosenstiel campus, where we house a lot of fish that are important for research in aquaculture. And so there was a lot of concerns on the impacts of the noise on these animals. And what we know about noise pollution from a lot of organisms underwater is that it causes an increase in the stress hormone cortisol. So when they get stressed out, their cortisol rises, which helps them deal with the stressor. But when cortisol is high for too long, it can cause other downstream effects that are quite negative for the animal. And so the study came about to really just quantify the impact with the goal of, if it is really bad for the environment, it shouldn't necessarily be hosted along the coast. And there really wasn't very many studies that looked at noise pollution from the air into water. So there's a lot of studies that look at noise pollution underwater and the sources of sound coming from underwater, like shipping or drilling or dredging. All of those underwater sources are decently studied. We still have a lot to go, especially with understanding the chronic effects of noise pollution on marine mammals. But there are very few studies that looked at the sound coming from air into water. And a lot of sound is lost at that air-sea interface. And so We know with music festivals, and if you're ever outside of a music festival, you can hear the bass, right? It's those low frequency sounds that travel a lot farther. And that's also what fish hear. Fish hear in those lower frequencies. And so we were quite concerned that those low frequency sounds would be stressing out the fish. So what we did for this study was we put a hydrophone in Bear Cut, which is right next to, it was the waterway right next to some of the concert stages. And then we also put a hydrophone in some tanks that held some Gulf toadfish. And Gulf toadfish are this species that I studied for a lot of my PhD because they make a really excellent model for stress physiology. We know a lot about how they get stressed out, what stresses them out, to what degree they get stressed out, and kind of some of those impacts of the hormone cortisol. So we use them as our model. We knew a lot already about what stresses them out. And we put them in some tanks and we measured their cortisol levels before and during the concert. So my friend and I had the privilege of going, in our marine biology gear, our rash guards and our liquid nitrogen little tub amongst concert goers to measure the cortisol levels during the concert, kind of at our experimental hatchery right next to some of the concert stages. So it was a really interesting project. We did measure a 4 to 5 fold increase in cortisol during the concert compared to before the concert. So they did have an elevation in stress. We also measured an increase in sound during the concert, both in the tanks, of course, and then in the bay as well. And then kind of the implications for that were we were able to discuss our results as scientists at some of the city meetings regarding this concert returning back to Virginia Key. And there were a lot of other issues with the concert that kind of led to this being decided that it wasn't the best location for the concert. Now, this concert and many other concerts are still held along coastlines. And so I think it's a really interesting area of future study of what is our impact of noise on land being translated into the sea.
Yeah, thank you. That was a great overview of all the different pieces of that. When we were talking about this study, when we originally met, you mentioned that it kind of had to be designed with legal concerns in mind. Can you talk a little bit more about that in the designing of the study and also how it applied after the study was finished?
Sure. Sometimes when research projects are going to be used to make decisions for companies or for governments or, state or local governments, you have to be really meticulous with your data collection and make sure that you're doing the science in really the best way possible. So that way your results are pretty sound and it's pretty hard to contest them. That's something that I didn't have a ton of experience with, but during my postdoc, which I think we might talk about some of the oil work that I did, as well as the sound pollution, it's just something that you have to be able to make sure that your data is recorded correctly, make sure that all of your methods are written out, you're writing all your notes in your lab books and making sure that it's legible in case anybody wanted to kind of follow up on your results to make sure that they are the best that they could be and that you're really doing your science in a way that is the best scientific process available.
So yeah, that does lead into the other research topic that I wanted to talk about, which is looking at the changes in stress responses after oil spills in Gulf toadfishes. So what changes did you see after studying this topic in terms of how that impacted their survival?
This study came out of funding that came from the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, which happened in 2010 in the Gulf of Mexico, which was the largest oil spill in U.S. history. And after the oil spill, there was a large settlement, again, talking about kind of the legal and the science aspects working together. There's a large settlement which gave a lot of grant funding to scientists to study the impacts of the oil spill and then also how to best restore the environment after the oil spill and then really what to do in the future if it were to happen again. So immediately after the oil spill, scientists started looking at bottlenose dolphins. And what they found was lots of different types of physiological impacts that were actually quite chronic and lasted years after the oil spill. And one of those effects was that they had lower stress hormone levels than what would be expected. So the way that they get these samples is they put a large net around a dolphin, kind of walk it in and then take a bunch of samples from that dolphin. So there's veterinarians or scientists, there's all sorts of team members present to make sure that this animal is being studied in the safest way possible, both for humans and for the animal. And this is called a health assessment. And so they're done fairly regularly. They're really important to be able to get a baseline health of a population, but they're also sometimes done when there are like environmental catastrophes, like an oil spill. So immediately after the spill, they were taking blood samples from the dolphins in Barataria Bay. And what they found was that when they, chased them and got a net around them, that should stress an animal out, right? It would stress us out. And so we would have naturally high cortisol. And like I mentioned, cortisol is a hormone that needs to be elevated to help you survive that stressor. It gives you glucose, it gives you sugar and energy to make sure that you are being able to survive that stressor along with other physiological effects. What they did was they compared those cortisol levels to a population in Sarasota Bay, Florida, where they've been doing health assessments on those dolphins for many years. And they found that they actually had lower cortisol after being caught than control or Sarasota Bay dolphins that had not been exposed to the oil. And that suggests something that's not normal. They should be having those higher cortisol levels. So it's quite difficult to study marine mammals in a laboratory, right? There's lots of ethical concerns. There's, physical concerns. It's a lot harder to do research on managed care marine mammals. So oftentimes you can use a model organism to study one animal. And that's a lot of what my background is comparative physiology. So using one model organism to study the physiology of another. And so we did that with our Gulf toadfish. Again, they make an excellent model for stress physiology. And so we looked at the cortisol levels after being exposed to really low concentrations of oil for a week and a month. And what we did was we did different dilutions of the oil, but they're very, very low values, something that would be environmentally relevant after the spill, after the oil kind of diluted and dissipated a little bit. So after we exposed them to pretty low concentrations of oil, we did two things. One, after they were exposed to oil for a certain amount of time, maybe 3 days or a week, we took them out of the oil and took a blood sample and then measured cortisol from that. Another one we did was we simulated a predator chase. So we chased them around a little bit with a net, simulating a predator chase, which would be a natural stressor in the wild. And then we took a blood sample. And what we found was even after a week of being exposed to the oil and then a week of recovery, so they were exposed to oil for 7 days and then they were just in clean seawater for 7 days. At that blood sample time point at 14 days, we saw that the fish that were stressed out by a natural chase stressor had lower cortisol than the control, so the ones that were not exposed to the oil, suggesting very similarly to dolphins that they can't mount or have a proper stress response. Their cortisol is low even in the face of a stressor, which again suggests that that's not a healthy response. So interestingly, the bottlenose dolphin studies looked at the adrenal glands and found that their adrenal glands were injured or damaged from the oil, but toadfish release their cortisol from intrarenal cells within their kidney and they don't have adrenal glands. And so it's really interesting, and that's a lot of what the follow-up research in the lab that I worked in is looking at is, what mechanistically is happening within the level of the kidney or even the brain, because the way cortisol is released is that there is this cascade from the brain down to where your cortisol is produced and released. So in humans, we have what's called the HPA axis, and same with bottlenose dolphins. It's the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis. So when your brain perceives a stressor, your hypothalamus releases corticotropin releasing factor or corticotropin releasing hormone, CRF or CRH, they're the same thing. And then that tells your pituitary to release ACTH or adrenocorticotropic hormone. And then that tells your adrenal gland, or if you're a fish, your interrenal cells to produce and release cortisol in the face of a stressor. And so what's interesting is that oil is having this effect on both teleost fish and marine mammals. And basically not allowing them to have a proper stress response. So we see that chronically. In the oil spill, it was, up to a couple of years after the oil spill within the dolphins. And in fish, we've only done a study now looking at a month of oil exposure, and they still have reduced cortisol.
Is that change something that's apparent in their behavior, or is it more something that you can really only tell through studying it the way that you explained?
That's a great question. We actually didn't do behavior studies on the toadfish. I did behavior studies in my PhD on toadfish, and they're not the best behavioral model. They're a sedentary fish, so they sit at the bottom and they really don't do very much. And so one of my studies looked at, we were studying male-to-male aggression and looking at their communication chemically during those aggressive interactions. And they moved maybe like 1% of the entire night. Like they just really don't move very much. They do have really interesting aggressive behaviors, but it's not something that we studied with the oil. They have done with other teleost fish, lots of behavioral studies looking at oil and how it kind of affects their ability to swim. And then what else was I going to say about toadfish? I don't remember. Sorry. I lost my train of thought.
That's okay. It was kind of a More just a I'm curious question. My last question kind of on that topic before we move on, are there any other examples off the top of your head of model organisms used in marine science studies, just to get an idea of what that looks like in other cases?
Absolutely. And this is a growing area of research, around the world, and also for the University of Miami Rosenstiel School, is looking at using marine organisms as a biomedical model. And so there's lots of different ones. The ones that come to mind are Aplysia californica, which is a sea hare or a sea slug. They're purple from the algae they eat. They ink a bright purple. They're very, very cool. And we actually have the national resource for Aplysia here at the University Rosenstiel School. They are an excellent model for neuroscience. They have really simple nervous systems. And so we use them to study aging and different effects of various stressors or pollutants on how they can kind of respond. And then you can look at those nerves and those neurons very detailed to see exactly what is happening. So we have a lot of that research here at the University of Miami. There's also zebrafish, which are more freshwater species, but they're a very common aquatic model for human health. And there's a lot more.
Awesome. Thank you. So you're the director of a program called Water Advocates and Visionaries for the Environment and Sea, or WAVES for short. Two big components of this program are immersive field trips and educational kits for in-classroom learning. So before we talk about those specific things, what are the goals of this program as a whole?
Sure. So this is a program that's actually sort of been around the University of Miami Rosenstiel School for quite a while now. And so one of my mentors and former colleagues, Dr. Jill Richardson, actually founded a program called Ocean Kids in 2008. And what she realized was there's quite a lot of students in Miami-Dade County who live very close to the ocean but don't have access to going to the beach, to seeing the ocean, to learning about marine science. And most of those students are underrepresented minorities in STEM and live in low-income communities. And so her main purpose was to make sure that those students are getting access to learning about the ocean, things that I had the privilege of having when I was a kid. Like I mentioned, I got to go to aquariums as a kid. And so I was quite privileged, and that led to me wanting to be a marine scientist. So making sure that all kids have that access. So she started this program in 2008, and I actually started volunteering with it when I was an undergrad in 2010. And I've been volunteering with the event every year since then. And then when I was hired on as a lecturer, I started hosting the event alongside her. And we were able to expand it with a grant from NOAA and the National Marine Sanctuary Foundation to older students. So previously it was mostly for elementary students. And then we were able to host an event for middle and high school students and start developing those kits for middle and high school students. So very recently, I've decided to kind of just rename the program just so it's a little bit more inclusive of all age groups. So I named it WAVES. And it is also really exciting because with the broader name, we're kind of looking towards finding new ways of expanding the program and providing more students in Miami-Dade with access to marine science. I can't remember if that's what you asked me.
Yeah, I was just kind of asking about what the goals of the program are, but that goes into my next question as well, which is why are programs like this necessary and important for students' futures?
Oftentimes, universities like the University of Miami are fairly inaccessible, right? You have to have funding or financial aid to come to a school like this. And we're producing really fantastic research that is cutting edge and making sure that we are prioritizing research in conservation and protecting the marine environments that we all depend on. So our, Miami-Dade is very dependent on Biscayne Bay and the local waterways. And so it's really important that our research takes into account local communities and that we're sharing our research and our knowledge with the local communities, especially those who may not have access. And so our program really targets K through 12 students and making sure that our research, marine science, education, and knowledge is easily accessible to the teachers, to the students. And we also want them to think that college is a possibility for them or that university is a possibility for them. So with our field trips, we actually bring the K through 12 students to our campus. And it's been hosted previously both at the main campus of the University of Miami and our marine science campus. So we bring the students here, we fund everything, and this event WAVES in general, the program is funded by both grants and community donations, which have really helped us expand the program over the last couple of years. But when we bring the students, we fund everything. So we fund their breakfast, their lunch, their transportation, t-shirts. we send them home with goodie bags that have ocean-themed school supplies. And they basically, when they come to our campus, they go station by station and meet different scientists and students from the University of Miami in all different fields. So we invite laboratories at the University of Miami. We invite students to host a station, and they learn about everything. They learn about the aplysia, like I talked about in human health models. They learn about coral reef restoration with Rescue Reef. They learn about how they extract DNA from a strawberry and equate that to how scientists extract DNA from fish. They look at various organisms under a microscope. They get to touch slimy toadfish or slimy aplysia and other invertebrates. They practice rescuing a manatee or a dolphin. They get to do all of these really awesome hands-on activities with the goal of really connecting with our students. So that has been a really important focus over the last couple of years, is making sure that the graduate students, undergraduate students, and the faculty and staff that are hosting these stations are connecting with our students and making sure that we're kind of moving away from this unilateral outreach approach where we basically just give our information to them. We're really trying to have a more asset-based approach where we know these students know a lot, right? We're trying to figure out what they know and how we can really engage and excite them about what they may not know. So one of the things that has come along with that is that we've developed a course at the University of Miami to organize and host this event, which is called Broadening Participation in Marine Science. And that course is for upper level undergraduate students and for graduate students. And they basically get to meet the students. So they visit the schools, they get to know the students, again, kind of building this familiarity, this connection before and after the event to make sure that they're not just coming to the event and they think that we forget about them. We really want them to know that we see them, we see their worth and their knowledge, and that they can be marine scientists just like we are if they wanted to be. We also collect survey data during that time period when we meet the students. So we learn a little bit about what they need, what their community needs are, what impact we're having on them with regards to learning or their STEM identity or their understanding of different marine science and conservation topics. We care very deeply about making sure that they feel included in the conservation efforts in Miami-Dade County as well.
With having the participation from the students at the University of Miami through the course, do the topics of the stations that the field trip students go through change kind of with each iteration of the course, or how does that kind of impact what students end up learning about?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the way we plan the event, and I try and be as hands-off as possible because these are, skills that I got in planning the event and volunteering for the event through my graduate and undergraduate career. So I try and let the students make as many decisions about the event as possible. So the way it works is we usually send out an email to Rosenstiel faculty and staff and invite them to host a station based on their lab, which also gets, it allows them to expand their broader impacts of their own research and sharing their research with the community, which is really important, not just in general, but also for grant writing and getting more funding to do the research is how are you sharing it and are you sharing it in an effective way? So we usually invite faculty and staff, and then we usually have about time for maybe 12 educational stations, give or take, depending on the year. And if we don't fill up those 12, oftentimes the students in the class will decide which topic their students are kind of missing and develop an activity and host that station. So it depends on the year, but then the students are also responsible for finding ways to engage with the students before, after, and during the event, how to make the event run smoothly, and how to make sure that we're communicating with the scientists and the other students who are volunteering at the stations, that they're communicating their science in an effective way for the age group that's showing up.
What are some of the considerations that go into working with K through 5 students versus the older students?
There's a lot. They obviously have a little bit of a shorter attention span, and so we try and move them pretty quickly through the stations. We also aim to make sure that we're not overwhelming them, that we're giving them breaks when they need. We also want the activities to be as hands-on as possible. So we try and avoid too much of just talking at them. We try to really practice asking them questions, getting their answers, guiding them towards the answers, and then having them practice. So they do a race for recycling one where they practice what they recycle, what they throw out, what they compost. They, again, do the DNA dissection. So they're doing things hands-on, which we do also for the older students, but we kind of narrow it down. And that's something that's always a challenge as a science communicator, is how do you condense everything you want to say into a couple of minutes. Our stations are only maybe 8 to 12 minutes, depending on the year. So how do you get across everything you want to say in a very short amount of time for a K-5 student? It can be quite challenging, but it's very good practice for all types of students to be able to communicate their research that way.
Great. So next, talking about the educational kits that Waves puts together. So they've been provided to K-12 schools throughout Miami-Dade, and they include lesson plans, presentations, and lab supplies. What barriers in accessible education does this part of the program kind of help break through that are different from what the field trips do?
One of the things that we really found as a challenge or a slight weakness in our program is that, it was a once, maybe twice a year event, and we could only take 100 to 200 students a year. So we weren't reaching as many students as we wanted. And we also know that a field trip is awesome. And there's lots of learning and absorption of information that happens at a field trip. But we're also kind of missing the classroom component. We want to kind of make sure that their education in marine science and conservation is continuing just outside of the event. So our goal with these kits was to reach students that we weren't able to reach with the event, and then also just provide a more varied curriculum for schools on topics that maybe K-12 teachers aren't as familiar with, and also making sure that they are providing actionable information to participate in conservation. Because oftentimes we leave either underrepresented minorities or lower socioeconomic classes out of the conservation movement. And so it's really important to include them as well, as they can oftentimes be disproportionately affected by climate change or environmental challenges. So with the kits, we have about 10 to 12 lesson plans that are created alongside some of the research laboratories. And they're created by student interns that are either funded by, again, community donations or from grants. So this MPS students, or if an undergraduate student wanted to apply, are responsible for building the curriculum and working with different faculty members to make sure that they are communicating the science at whatever level we're making the kit for. So the goal of the kits is to provide more schools with more access to this curriculum. We're also working with the local district and trying to find a way to more formalize the implementation of our curriculum into the school district to make it a little bit more easy for teachers to access. I remember when I taught high school, there's so much content available, but you really have to know where to find it. And you also sometimes have to pay for it. And that can be really difficult. So oftentimes with, and I realize this as a high school teacher, is there's so much content available for teachers, but oftentimes it may be hard to find. You don't really know where to find it, or you're overwhelmed with how much content is out there. Or sometimes the content, it kind of gives you what you need to educate your students, but it doesn't really do it in a very concrete way where it really writes out a full lesson plan of what to do. And so that can be overwhelming as a teacher, especially if you have to pay for it and it's behind, resources that your school might not have. So our goal is to make our curriculum freely available. We also, with grant funding, are able to provide some of those supplies to do these hands-on activities like extracting microplastics from a sample or practicing a marine mammal rescue and some of those skills that come with that. So our curriculum, and we're building it over time, we want to make sure that our students are getting hands-on activities. They're practicing things other than just science, right? They're practicing their math, their reading comprehension, their understanding of the ocean. So we're working on building new lesson plans every year with different student interns and working with different research faculty at our university to make sure that their research is getting communicated to. We'd also really like, and that's a goal within the next year or two, is to develop teacher professional development. So we are training the teachers on how to teach some of these topics, getting them out to our campus so they can see kind of what a marine science laboratory looks like, what's going on in the lab, so then they can communicate that to their students. And really just with the goal of having a bigger impact on our community as possible.
In a recent episode that we recorded that kind of focused on education in the context of Australia, the guest mentioned that a lot of the marine science related education happened when teachers had a personal interest in the topic and brought it into the classroom for that reason. Do you see something similar happening with the teachers who decide to participate in your programs?
Sure, it could be. It could be that they have an interest in it. Oftentimes, especially in Florida, they have to stick to their science standards, right? And so if that age group doesn't have marine science within their standards, it can be quite tricky to work it in. And so that's something we're also working on, is for those grade levels that aren't focused on the environment or the oceans, how can we work in examples of marine science into what their standards are, whether that be for science or not, right? We can do it with math examples. We can do it with reading comprehension. So that's another one of our goals, is sometimes, you're right, teachers who have an interest are able to kind of work it in a little bit easier. But for teachers that may not be interested, or just may never have really learned about it, or don't feel confident in teaching it, or don't have access to the curriculum, we want to find ways to get it as easy as possible integrated into their lesson plans.
So you kind of touched on this a little bit throughout us talking about this program, but how has WAVES evolved over time in response to changing goals and needs in the community? And also, what role does grant funding play in those decisions?
Yeah, it has been community funded for a really long time. Like I said, Dr. Richardson founded it in 2008, and it's been funded by various sources over the years, which can be challenging as a faculty member who I'm balancing teaching and grading and different faculty jobs and, dabbling in research. It can be tricky to then have to organize an entire outreach event and find funding for it. And so the grant funding over the last couple of years has been really helpful, because it's helped us kind of invest in some of the materials that we can use year to year. And it's also kind of helped us find new ways to grow the program. And so previously it was really just a once a year event, but a lot of the grant applications are looking for bigger impacts than that, right? They don't want you to just have a one-day field trip. So this has really pushed us to try and figure out how can we expand the program and how can we best use the grant funding to do so. So some of those things have been creating those kits, the lesson plans, potentially teacher professional development, and then hosting more of the events. So the events usually are about, like I said, 100 to 200 students visiting, and then anywhere between 50 and 70 volunteers. So we need a lot of volunteers to take their day and help us at each of the stations, at lunch, etc. And so it can be quite challenging to find a day that works for everyone and that everyone's available. And so the goal with some of that funding would be to host the event at least twice a year, or find ways to host smaller ones, or maybe visit more schools so we can have more frequent, smaller impacts.
And what outcomes have you seen so far from this program, and what are your hopes for the future of it and of ocean education as a whole?
Sure. So like I mentioned, over the last couple of years, we've been collecting survey data before and after the event to look at the impact of the event, and then also what are they learning from the event. And we're working on publishing this data. So I'm working on having some of my students write up and analyze this data and then publish it. So some of the results that we found so far is that after the event, we've measured a % increase in students who want to go to college and study science, felt like they belonged in a college campus, understanding various threats of the marine environments, an increase in students who have seen a scientist who looks like them. That representation is really, really important for students who want to go into marine science. We've had increases in students believing that they could be a scientist if they want to, understanding the importance of emerging ocean threats that they may not have known about. And then we also have been able to, measure % increases in essentially quiz questions, right? Are they learning about different marine science topics? And they're learning quite a bit. That hands-on activity really will help them that will click in their mind and stick with them, a couple weeks after the event. Our goal would also to be measure more long-term effects. What are the effects over a long period of time that these lesson plans and these events could have on these students. Can I add one thing?
Yeah.
It's kind of to the question about how is this program grown?
Mm-hmm.
Another way that this program has grown and evolved over the last couple of years is that there's been the establishment very recently of our new center at the University of Miami Rosenstiel School, and it's called the Johnson Center for Marine Conservation. And it's a really awesome new center focused on not just research of how to best preserve our marine ecosystems, but also a huge element of outreach and community engagement. And so I'm the new partnerships and engagement coordinator for this center, and WAVES is now a part of this center. So working with the center and finding new ways to not just reach K through 12 students, but also other community members is a really big goal of ours in the coming years.
So I was just trying to find, when did the Ocean Kids program first start? Was
2008.
Okay, 2008. For some reason, I had 2019 in my head, which is not right at all.
Yeah, we started with Ocean Explorers in 2022, I think, which was the middle and high school, but Ocean Kids started in 2008.
I can't do the math in my head very quickly, but would those kids be like college age now? Do you have data on like how many of those students ended up going to college or anything like that?
Unfortunately, this program's been around for so long that we don't have the long-term data. It has really started as just an outreach event, and there wasn't a lot of research behind it. Again, like I mentioned, there's very limited resources in putting on some of these events, and so the research sometimes, unfortunately, has to be kind of put to the side. So that would be something that with grant funding, we could really get some students and faculty to be analyzing those metrics over time, because you're right, like these students are going into college, especially with our Ocean Explorers event that we hosted for middle and high school students in 2022. They would now be, thinking about going to college or going to college. And while we do have some anecdotal evidence, like if we go and talk to a teacher again, they will share like, hey, this student was really affected by this. Now they want to go to college to study X, Y, and Z in science. And so we have a couple anecdotal examples, but we don't have the data. And that's definitely something that we want to measure in the future.
This question kind of applies to the conservation center that you mentioned and the WAVES program, but what are ways that you try to get community members involved in conservation efforts?
Yeah, so the center is still new, but we're working on establishing a lot of engagement programs that rely on citizen science and just outreach events and communication. The director is Dr. Rebecca Gruby, and she studies large-scale MPAs or marine protected areas, and she works directly with communities that are mostly affected by these MPAs and making sure that they are taking into consideration they're part of the decision-making process when establishing and enforcing these MPAs. We also have Dr. Catherine McDonald, who studies sharks. So she's the director of the Shark Research and Conservation Program, where she has citizen science programs where people get to go out and tag sharks and learn about shark ecology and conservation. We're also getting a new marine mammal scientist who is looking to establish a citizen science program studying dolphins and manatees around Miami. And then we're also looking for a sea turtle biologist and any other scientists at the University of Miami already who are interested in doing research and engagement and citizen science in marine conservation are kind of now all a part of this center. So it's a more localized way to get our research communicated to the community as directly as possible.
Okay, that sounds super exciting. Those are all of the questions that I have for you. Is there anything else that you'd like to add in as kind of final words or?
I don't have anything else to add, but thank you so much for inviting me to be on this podcast. It's been really wonderful to talk about some of my old research and the WAVES program, as it's been really exciting to continue to evolve this program over the last couple of years.
Yeah, thank you. I'm really glad that we could get you in as a guest, and it was great talking to you.
You too. Thank you so much.
Thanks for tuning into Shellphone. To learn more about our projects, suggest a guest, and sponsor or donate to the show, visit our website at breachthesurface.org or social media at breachthesurface. To learn more about the University of Miami's Rosenstiel School of Marine Atmospheric and Earth Science and the WAVES program, visit their website at earth.miami.edu or their Instagram pages at Waves for Future and at UMiami Conservation.